Why is it that most first-person shooter boss battles suck? In this episode, I wanted to go a little more in depth than I did in my last episode and get at what exactly it is that makes for a great boss battle, particularly in a first-person shooter. These are the 5 elements I believe most crucial to a great boss. As I mentioned in my last video, mobility is what makes it possible to have a good first-person shooter boss battle. The modern military shooter setting that became so popular in the last 5 to 10 years required limited mobility so that these games could have a sort of feeling of realism. Slower movement speeds meant that these games focused more on cover-based fire and moving from cover to cover rather than skillful evasion. Thankfully, the dominance of the military shooter is waning, and instead we're seeing a return to a more fantasy-type backdrop. Think of Overwatch, think of Superhot, think of Doom. A setting that doesn't focus on realism gives the player much more flexibility. For example, the developer could allow the player to run 30 miles an hour, jump 20 feet into the air, or even double jump or teleport. By not focusing on realism, there's just a lot more that you can do and add to a boss fight. Mobility is just one ingredient, and being highly mobile isn't going to help you much if enemies only use hit-scan weapons. When a hit-scan weapon is fired, it instantly hits whatever the character is looking at. This means that bosses will basically be doing damage whenever you are in their line of sight for more than a second or two. This is one of the major reasons that most first-person shooter boss battles, dating all the way back to Granddaddy Wolf 3D's Hans Gross boss battle at the end of the first chapter, require you to peek out from cover and shoot, only to return to cover and repeat this process over and over. I'll call this the peekaboo style of bosses, and most bosses tend to fall into this style, largely because of constraints imposed by the setting. Now, this isn't necessarily always a bad thing, but I think it's clear as to why it's limiting. As long as bosses have hit-scan weapons, most encounters will have the same peekaboo style. Now, the alternative is arming these bosses with projectile or melee attacks, or both, which we see heavy usage of in Doom 2016. Projectiles and melee attacks give the player the possibility to avoid taking damage. Where before, had the attack been hit-scan, the player would have taken the hit. Now they have the option not to. The ability to evade introduces skill and depth, both of which are largely missing from the peekaboo-style fights. This is one of the main reasons that bosses in third-person action games are generally so much better than those in shooters. Think about how much better the bosses are in something like God of War or Dark Souls. Third-person bosses favor skillful evasion rather than just hiding and taking pot shots. Where you fight the boss should be well considered. Realistic environments are not always going to be the best place to have a boss battle. Each of the arenas in Doom took place on kind of a simple platform, but at different points in the fight they were restricted or altered the area the player could move in order to keep the fight dynamic. Developers can use abstract arenas to tailor the environment, ideally, to each individual boss encounter. Instead of just having to use a realistic-looking space, they can kind of make whatever they want. If you're noticing a trend here, it's that setting can place heavy restrictions on what sort of gameplay is possible. While the modern military shooter was a great genre and produced a lot of great games, a modern setting doesn't really mesh well. It's not very compatible with a good boss battle. It's important that a boss is a challenge to beat, and I think nobody's going to be happy if they beat the boss at the first attempt. And it's also important that bosses be dynamic. The best bosses shift and change their tactics over the course of the fight. Dynamic encounters serve to keep the player engaged and on the edge of their seat. The best bosses do this. Think of Ornstein and Smo from Dark Souls, or literally every fight from Punch-Out. Great boss design often includes bosses that evolve to multiple stages or phases over the course of the fight. This sort of complexity serves not only to add depth, but can also make the fight more memorable. Who can forget the first time you knocked the Nameless King off his dragon, only to realize you had to fight him for real, on foot? A good boss should be more of a final exam than just a bookend to a level. A lot of bosses are just pumped up versions of regular enemies, with similar movesets and attack patterns. Now, this kind of design can lead to encounters being drawn out, dull, and just ultimately boring. By challenging the player to use all the tools the game has given the player to survive, the game adds depth and complexity, and depth and complexity are what make for a really fun boss battle. What do you think? Do you agree? Did I miss anything? What are some of your favorite boss battles? Please like and subscribe if you want more content like this. I will be responding to comments left below in my next episode, so please comment. And as always, thank you for watching. On the next episode of the Noshow, we are going to be taking a look at linear video games. We're going to go in-depth and examine whether or not linearity in video games is the problem that people make it out to be. I hope you stay tuned, and I'll see you next time.